So, you have two neighboring nations, both Islamic republics, who were allies for 30 years. And now, they're locked in a deadly border conflict. The partnership between Pakistan and Afghanistan hasn't just frayed, it has completely and spectacularly collapsed. The big question is, what on earth went wrong? Well, that's what we're going to break down.
And let's be absolutely clear, this isn't just some diplomatic spat with angry words. No, we're talking about real, intense firefights, military posts being overrun. It's a full-blown crisis that's escalating very, very quickly along their massive, rugged border. The whole situation is a tinderbox.
You know that old saying, the first casualty of war is the truth? Well, this is a perfect example. Pakistan is reporting that it lost 23 soldiers but killed over 200 militants. But then you hear Afghanistan's side of the story, and it's a completely different reality. They claim to have killed 58 Pakistani soldiers while losing only 9 of their own. I mean, those numbers are worlds apart. It just shows you how deep the mistrust and the propaganda is already running.
And the immediate impact on the ground? Just chaos. These major border crossings, which are absolute lifelines for trade and for people, have been completely shut down. And you have to understand, this isn't just a military issue. This is a massive humanitarian and economic crisis in the making. It's wrecking livelihoods for people and communities that have moved back and forth across this line for centuries.
So really, how did it get this bad? How did an alliance that Pakistan spent more than 3 decades building just completely fall apart? To really get what's happening today, we have to rewind the clock and look at the core policy that defined their entire relationship.
And it all boils down to these 2 words: strategic depth. This was the cornerstone of Pakistan's national security for decades. The idea was pretty simple. Make sure you have a friendly, controllable government in Kabul. Why? So that your western border is secure, which lets you focus all of your military power and attention eastward toward your biggest rival, India. And for Pakistan, the Afghan Taliban were always seen as the ticket to achieving that depth.
And this policy has deep roots. It started way back in the 80s, with Pakistan funneling weapons to the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets. By 1996, they were one of only 3 nations on Earth to recognize the first Taliban government. Even after 9/11, while they were officially an ally of the United States, they were playing a double game, secretly sheltering the Taliban leadership. So you can imagine, when the Taliban marched back into Kabul in August 2021, Islamabad must have thought, mission accomplished, our 30-year gamble paid off. As we're seeing now, they could not have been more wrong.
Now, this map is really at the heart of the story. It shows what you might call the original sin of this relationship, the Durand Line. The British drew it on a map back in 1896, and in doing so, they sliced the Pashtun ethnic group's homeland right in 2. And here's the key. No Afghan government, ever, has recognized this as a real international border. Not the kings, not the communists, and certainly not the Taliban. It's a wound that has festered for over a century.
But the one thing, the single biggest reason for this complete breakdown, is a group called the TTP. This is the point where Pakistan's grand strategy didn't just fail, it blew up right in its face.
Okay, and this is a really crucial point, so let's be clear. The TTP, or the Pakistani Taliban, is not the same thing as the Afghan Taliban who are running Afghanistan. The TTP does pledge allegiance to the Afghan Taliban, but their mission is completely different. Their number one goal is to wage war against the Pakistani government and create their own state.
And this chart, well, it shows you the consequences in stark visual terms. The moment Pakistan's supposed allies, the Afghan Taliban, took power in August 2021, attacks by the TTP inside Pakistan just went through the roof. We're talking a massive, shocking surge in violence. These militants, feeling emboldened and with a safe haven right next door, just started relentlessly hitting Pakistani security forces.
This famous quote just perfectly sums up Pakistan's problem. For decades, they cultivated these groups to push their influence into Afghanistan. But that strategy has come home to roost, big time. The snakes they kept in their backyard are no longer just biting their neighbors. This is a classic textbook case of strategic blowback.
So this brings us to the total gridlock we see today. Pakistan is furious, accusing the Afghan Taliban of giving shelter to thousands of TTP fighters, letting them train and launch attacks from Afghanistan. And the Taliban's response? A flat denial. They just say, that's your problem, not ours. And with that, the conversation is over. They're at a complete impasse.
Now, a conflict this big never happens in a vacuum.
The breakdown between Islamabad and Kabul is sending shockwaves all across the region. It's creating brand new crises and forcing all the neighboring countries to completely rethink their strategies.
One of the worst consequences has been a huge humanitarian crisis. In response to the TTP attacks, Pakistan started deporting undocumented Afghans en masse. And the result, as you can see from this chart, was a staggering, unprecedented spike in people being forced to leave. We're talking about nearly 400,000 people pushed back into a country already facing its own deep crises.
And make no mistake about it, these people are not leaving by choice. A jaw-dropping 97% of them said the main reason they left was because they were terrified of being arrested. This policy is causing immense suffering, and it's fueling a deep, bitter resentment towards Pakistan among everyday Afghans. You have to wonder if it's just creating a new generation of enemies.
So as Pakistan tries to apply economic pressure, the Taliban are proving to be surprisingly resourceful. They're actively moving away from their historic dependence on Pakistan. You can see it right here. Trade with Pakistan is plummeting. Meanwhile, it's surging with Iran, and it's also on the rise with China. Every day this goes on, Pakistan's economic leverage gets weaker and weaker.
And all the other players in the region are making their moves. India, to Pakistan's absolute dismay, has sent diplomats back to Kabul. China is getting very nervous about the security of its massive investments in Pakistan. Iran is emerging as a critical new trade partner. And you've got Gulf powers like Saudi Arabia and Qatar trying to step in as mediators. The geopolitical map of the region is literally being redrawn in real time.
So, with the relationship in shambles and the border essentially a war zone, where does all this go from here? Well, analysts are looking at three main possibilities for what the future holds.
Okay, scenario one is the most dangerous, armed escalation, where these border clashes spiral into a much bigger, more sustained conflict. A more likely outcome might be a managed stalemate. Think of it as a tense, cold conflict, where the border stays heavily militarized and these occasional flare-ups just become the new, unstable normal. And then finally, you have the most hopeful path, a mediated realignment, where an outside power like China or Qatar somehow manages to get both sides to step back from the brink and talk.
And so, this entire crisis really forces us to ask a fundamental question. When you spend decades nurturing a proxy group to fight your battles, what happens when they actually win? As Pakistan is learning the hard way, the answer seems to be that your proxy, now a power in its own right, will always follow its own interests, even if that means turning on the very patron that helped bring it to power.